There are two stitches to learn when you first get started in knitting. The first is the knit stitch and the second is the purl stitch. In this video, I'm going to share how to do the knit stitch. Hi Sugar Snaps, my name is Brittany. Welcome to the Textile Indie YouTube channel. Here we cover all things fibercraft and textile arts. Right now I'm in the middle of a knitting series going over the very foundational steps you need to know to get started in knitting. In knitting, there are two different ways to hold your yarn, to throw the yarn around the needle. And one of those is called the English method and the other is called the continental method. You can create your own version of those if you want, and I've seen many different skilled knitters do it slightly different ways. So find what works for your body and your hands and make that work for you. I find that not everybody is comfortable with the same knitting method. So if you find continental works better for you than English, it's not wrong, it's just a different way and it works great. My yoga teacher likes to say, find what feels good in your body because everybody is different. So I'd like to invite you to pursue that kind of mindset when you're learning knitting. Learn to do both ways and find which one feels the best for you, and then just pursue that one until you feel satisfied and get to a good pace. And if you want to learn another method, you can, but you definitely don't have to. Before going any further and diving into how to do the knit stitch, I wanted to share that there is some confusion in the knitting language. Knitting is the action of creating fabric with yarn and needles. But knitting is also a stitch used in knitting. There's knitting and there's purling, and then there's combinations of those to create different textures of fabric. When learning to purl, you don't change your language and start calling your fabric purling. It's still called knitting, even though you're doing the purl stitch. So as I go through the tutorial today, I'll be referring to the action as knitting, or the overall craft that we're doing, as well as the stitch that we're doing today as knitting. To show you how to complete a knit stitch, I'm going to start out with the jumbo yarn so that you can see it better on the camera, and then move to the worsted weight yarn so that you can see how it would look in one of the most common yarn sizes that knit projects are made with. For today, we're going to cast on 10 stitches. For a full tutorial on how to create a slip knot and cast on your knitting, check out the video here, and in the description below, I go over how to set up your knitting needles with your stitches. So I'm going to use the long tail cast on method. This is my favorite method for casting on, and we're going to start out with 10 stitches. So load your knitting needle with 10 stitches. If you need to, pause the video, go watch the cast on video really quick, and then come back to this section. So as you're casting on, each of the loops is a stitch. So you'll count each of these as one stitch. Once you have 10 stitches across, you're ready to start knitting. Now, the needle that you're working with is always going to be held in your left hand. So while we loaded the needle from our right hand, we're going to switch hands to our left hand. I'm going to give myself a little bit of excess yarn here to work with, to pull from, and then move the short tail out of the way so you don't accidentally grab it when you're knitting. So I'm gonna move that towards me and kind of tuck it under my arm so that it doesn't get in the way. And then you'll grab your blank needle or your empty needle with your right hand. And for the knit stitch, you're going to come in to the far side of the stitch. So I'm coming in on the left side of this stitch, and I'm going to catch the stitch, just the front, this front section, like so, and send the needle that's in my right hand to the back of the left hand needle. So again, that looks like this, coming from the front and angling towards the back of the left hand needle. So it looks like this in the front and this in the back. And the loop that's on the knitting needle here, if I take that out, you're just coming to the front of that loop. So I'm not catching both sides like this, I'm just catching the front of that loop. So now from the front, it's going to look like this. And now there's two ways to yarn over, and I'm going to start out showing you the English method, which is yarn in your right hand. Bring the yarn down towards the table out towards the left, up and around the needle in the back so that you're back on the right side. So we just basically kind of did a 360 around, creating a circle with your hand and looping the yarn around that needle underneath. And then you're gonna pull tight, just gently, on that yarn so that it slides under the needle that's on top and kind of situates towards you more. Now pull your needle that's in your right hand forward and use the tip to slide it along the curve of the left hand needle and pull the loop that you just created forward. And now you have a loop on your left hand needle and a loop on your right hand needle. I'm going to slide the stitches up the left hand needle and slide the loop off of the left needle. So again, let's go through that, and I'm not going to use left and right in my description because sometimes that's really confusing. So the needle here is going to come to the far edge or underneath the front of this loop to the back. I'm going to go around the world, create a loop around, pull slightly to catch the yarn in between the needles, and then pull this tip, the back tip, along the curve of the needle on top and pull it forward so that you're pulling the yarn from your skein into a loop on your top needle now. And then gently lift off that stitch that you just looped through off of your loaded needle, this guy right here. Again, you're going to come to the far side of that stitch, just to the top, go around the world with your yarn, pull gently to get it in between the needles, and then slide this forward and through. And you need to make sure that you drop this stitch off of the loaded needle, the needle with all the cast on stitches, so that you actually create a knit stitch. And you can see here, right in here, I'm creating some little knit stitches, or starting the fabric making process of my knitting. So to continue across, it's going to look like this. So there is your first row of knitting. You can see the little mini V's starting to form in there, right in here. So that is your first row of knitting. Once you get to the end of a row, you're going to flip your needle over so that all the stitches, or the loaded needle, is again in your left hand. And then we're going to knit on this side. If you knit in entirely knit stitch, again, there's the catch in the knitting language, knit as in the action as opposed to knit as the specific stitch. If you knit all of your stitches on both sides, you're going to end up in what's called garter stitch. And that is where you end up with these little waves on both sides of the fabric. So these little bubble shapes, and the typical V shape of the knit stitch gets hidden in between the little bubble stitches. So we end up with a garter stitch. Once we go into how to knit one side, purl the other, you'll be able to see the V stitches show up even more clearly. Now that you know how to complete a knit stitch, I'm going to show you the two different holds that you can throw your yarn. So throwing your yarn is a term referring to this process where you're taking the yarn and what I was calling going around the world with your yarn. This is called throwing, where you're looping it around the needle so that you can create your loop or your new stitch and slide that old stitch off the knitting needle. There are two different methods of throwing your yarn. In the English method, you're going to be holding your yarn in your right hand. So if I start out with creating a knit stitch, I'm holding the yarn. So I've got the needle in my pinky and ring finger, and I'm going to throw the yarn by looping it around, and it's sitting over my forefinger, like so. So I'm creating the knit stitch, looping the yarn around, and pulling that loop through. So the yarn sits between my middle finger, loops over my forefinger. I grab onto the needles, and then I'm able to throw the yarn without releasing the knitting needles. And this makes for efficiency and a little bit easier on your wrists and your fingers as you're knitting, especially if you're knitting for a long time. Phoebe's visiting and she's being very loud. Hi. You're in the middle of my tutorial. Are you gonna say hi to the people? Say hi to our friends. Say hello, sugar snaps. My name's Phoebe. So again, you're going to be looping the yarn over your forefinger. So if you tuck your forefinger into the yarn like so, you grab the end in between your ring finger and your pinky and then grab the needle with those same fingers. Then you can make a stitch and throw the yarn like so. So there's my second row. You can see again, the knit stitches are peeking out there and the purl side from the last row of knitting is on this side. To get more information from me and from Textile Indie, sign up for my email update list. The link to that is in the description below. Add your name and email and you'll receive a twice-a-month email with resources, updates, new content that I have on Textile Indie YouTube channel and the website, and other goodies from the Textile Indie team. For the continental method of knitting, you're going to set up your needles like a regular knit stitch and then bring the yarn over your left forefinger and into your hand, into your fingers in the same ways we did on the right, but this time in the left hand. I'll grab the yarn with my needle and pull it forward like so. So I'm creating a stitch, stitch around and through, stitch around and through. Now I want to show you the same knit stitch on the worsted weight yarn. And now I'm going to hold the yarn in my right hand in the English method and bring the needle from the top backwards behind the loaded needle, yarn over, bring that loop forward and drop that previous stitch. So bring the needles through, yarn over, bring that through. Once you get to the end of the row, you'll flip it over, keep the loaded needle in the left hand, and start a new row. There is row 2. Once again, what I'm doing is taking the needle in my right hand, bringing it through the top of this first stitch towards the back. So catching the top loop towards the back and then yarning over right to left, pulling the needle through to catch that loop, and then dropping the previous loop to create a stitch. Each time you drop that stitch that was on your left needle, you're creating a stitch by pulling this new loop through. So I just created a loop around the right hand needle, pulled that loop through, and now I need to drop this loop off the left needle to create a stitch. And that's my stitch right there. So loop around, pull through, yarn off. Loop around, pull through, yarn off. And this is the English throwing method or the right hand throwing method. And I'll switch sides. And this time I'll do the left hand. So for the continental method, you're going to bring your needle through like you normally would. Bring your needle through, catch the yarn, and then pull your finger back and the needle forward so you can keep that loop on the knitting needle. So I'll catch a stitch, loop it around, catch the yarn, pull through. Catch a stitch, loop it around, pull through. Stitch, loop it around, pull through. And just like with the English method, we're trying to catch the yarn in between the needles so that as we pull through, it doesn't slide off and get away from us. And there is our knit stitches formed into garter stitch. You can see the knit side in between the waves for the purls. Now you have the information you need to get started knitting. Which method did you prefer? Leave a comment below to let me know. Check out textileindie.com for a collection of beginner knitter projects. We have a full blog post with 31 projects you can do or get started in knitting. You can find that in the description below. Hit the like button and subscribe. Hit the bell so you get notified whenever I put out a new video. I so appreciate being able to do this and walk the creative journey with you. Experiment creatively. Until my next video, happy making. See you later. Bye.